this actually touches quite an interesting point
Yes.
about the call for election observers. Do you know that Trinidad and Tobago has never had for local government elections any observer capacity, because it is a renowned fact that our Elections and Boundaries Commission is one of the best in the world.
Absolutely.
And our media is to be complimented as well for the transparency and coverage that we have.
Yes.
What we're selling on this occasion, folks, what we're asking you to pay attention to is how are our lives going to be better with reform that is here. We are no longer in discussion. We are no longer in hypothetical matters. We are talking about, are you for or against a better style of life? Are you for or against your mayors having full control? Are you for or against full-time councillors?
Absolutely.
So the choice is really now. And this is where we make the clarion call for people to step up and participate in democracy. Because I'll tell you this, choice cannot be had unless there's an exercise of the franchise, and the franchise is in this finger. It's the power to vote. So Laurel, I know you've run for elections. Your feet are deep into politics. Your heart is there. What do you think this means for us?
And I also served as an alderman. I also served as an alderman in the Riverport Corporation. So I have a fair understanding of the operations of local government and the work of local government. And I must say that the reform is absolutely necessary. The system as it stands now is pretty sluggish, I would say, and there's a lot of bureaucracy in getting things done, and the councillors and the mayor do not have sufficient power to execute the will and the needs of the people. And so that's what this reform is bringing now. It's giving the councillors and the aldermen and the executive council the opportunity to really service the people of their municipalities. And with the 141 electoral districts, that means that each representative has a smaller number of persons to service, which makes it easier, which makes your representative much more accessible. And we're giving more power to your local representatives, and that's what this election is about. That's why we're asking you to vote for our 141.
And the more power is significant power. We're not talking about minor issues. We're talking about major issues. Planning and facility development. We're talking about maintenance of schools. We're talking about anti-crime and security issues through municipal police. Folks, I served as an alderman in local government. I've had the pleasure of drafting the local government reform law through millions of contact hours of consultation. And I can tell you this, now operationalizing this law, I am convinced, we, our party, are convinced that this is the closest that we're going to get to real reform in our country because of, exactly as Laurel said, bringing power closer to people. On the other side of the equation, you will hear political opponents say no to reform, no to more power, no to the use of residential property taxes at $3 a day to meet the gap in expenditure. And we say to the population, genuinely, look at the data and understand this is how we create better lives.
And it's important to ask, why is it that the opposition is rejecting so strongly these changes that will impact you, the people of Trinidad, so positively?
You know what hit me? It hit me what Marcus Gidari had to say from San Fernando. In Marcus Gidari, serving as a UNC councillor, elected in 2019.
And who we just presented.
Who we just presented for San Fernando. But what struck me with what Marcus had to say was the reason why he decided that the PNM was the vehicle to take the message to people. And his position was quite simple, that it meant that reform was for all and that he was on about policy. And perhaps that's why we've seen so many people join the PNM.
Thread. That is the common message and sentiment that is coming out of all of the persons who have now come into the fold of the People's National Movement because they believe in the People's National Movement. The PNM is credible and we're really serious about this reform.
And folks, I want to put it to you this way. The reform that we are proposing for the country that calls for this vote is a reform that applies equally beneficially to the opposition. We are saying in some of the seats that we presented, folks, there are instances in the history of the results where the PNM has not held certain seats.
Yes.
We are saying give these councillors better power, better management, greater accountability. And I want to remind you, we're doing this in the context of having operationalized the public procurement law.
Welcome back, folks. That was a snippet from the PNM's candidate revelation, local government launch. I can't remember what specific term they made of it, but that happened over the weekend. That was local government minister and public relations officer Faris Al Rawi, joined by government senator, public education officer, and former public relations officer of the PNM, Senator Laurel Lezama-Lee Sing. And there are some interesting things that they said there, at least from my perspective. And the first thing, because they started off with reform, reform was the main topic that they discussed in that part of their broadcast and their stream. They spoke about how, this election is about local government reform. This election. I find that interesting because, well, we were told that the local government election that was supposed to have been held at around the start of the year was going to be delayed until, a similar time period in the following year, because they want to implement reform from the recently passed bills partially declared local government reform. I believe that was the point. Correct me if I'm wrong. That's why they took the year. It was, you don't need to take a year to increase the candidate's duration by a year. That's just done, right? If that was the big change that you wanted to do, you could have just done it for the next election. No. They increased the candidate's term by a year because they wanted time to enact at least some of the changes, One of which we believe would be procurement, property tax, which that's the one thing that we're seeing some sort of progress being made as, the legislation, etc., was debated, etc., etc. So the issue is, this was not supposed to be an election issue, right? At the very least, some reform should have been seen if work was being done on it, because we had about 5 months or so before the election was to be called, that we knew it was going to be called. So when was it that they were going to do the implementation based off what they said in the past? And now it seems as though they're kind of scrubbing over that history, not necessarily rewriting it, they're just not mentioning it, and saying, well, no, now this election is all about local government reform because, somehow the local government results is going to preclude Parliament from enacting changes. I don't know how local government aldermen are going to have a say with regards to what Parliament can and cannot do. So I don't necessarily even know why it's an issue. I guess you could say, well, this vote will kind of set the mandate of what we want to see. But the mandate is so indirect. It's so indirect to the issue, right? The local government representatives, as far as I'm aware, do not actually have a vote with regards to the reform. They were consulted, and that was a whole issue by itself, and we ain't going to get into that. But, at the end of the day, Parliament has to, make the decision. Parliament, Cabinet, House and the Senate, etc. And, the government enacts it. So I'm kind of confused, like how all of a sudden something that was supposed to have been started to be implemented at the start of the year, maybe even at the end of last year, how all of a sudden that has become an election issue for the upcoming elections in August. When did that happen? Now, again, like I said, it could be that the government is looking to get a mandate. If they win overwhelmingly in this local government election, they could say, well, you see, the country approves. Technically speaking, though, the country could decide, hey, we want to vote in PNM across the board. That doesn't mean that we approve of their reform. Think about it, right? Doesn't necessarily mean that. And not voting for PNM across the board or voting for PNM at all is not going to necessarily stop the local government reform. So again, it's an indirect connection. Questions were raised by both Minister Al Rawi and Senator Lezama-Lee Sing about the opposition's opposition to the reforms. The irony, of course, is the local government minister, he did say, well, look, this is to the benefit of UNC regions as well. The irony, of course, is Opposition Senator Janti Lashminial, I believe just last week, pointed out an example where she questioned, based on some of the ways that the minority of a council would be sidelined. She used the potential UNC majority-led council, saying, hold on, we could sideline PNM people. That's not right. So why do we want this moving forward? So at least one situation we have specifically where how a minority could just be silenced in these potentially new executives, because we haven't necessarily seen what the final structure would be. She brought up an issue with that. And she didn't say the PNM going to sideline her. She said the UNC could sideline the PNM. That ain't right. So there is some fair criticisms there. Granted, it's hard to find them sometimes because the opposition opposes everything for the sake of opposing. But it's there. And yes, it might take extra work on your end, but in this case, I think it would, behoove the government to find those important pieces of opposition and address them. Because it's not about appeasing the UNC or appeasing UNC voters. It's about trying to make this reformation, this legislation, the best that it could be, not so? So seek out good ideas or good criticisms wherever you may find them. Even if most of what is said in criticism of the reforms is nonsense. This is not just a light issue, a fly-by-night issue, a political issue. This is going to affect local government moving forward. So, it's interesting. What do you think, folks? You think this is going to be, the mandate-setting election that it seems as though the politicians, the analysts, the commentators, it's being positioned as such? Should it even be? How important is this local government election? You want to be left behind by not participating? Folks, let's end this here. When we come back, we should have the TTPS Media Ambassador get into more important and maybe unfortunate things here as crime continues unabated in the nation. Stay tuned. Talking Point. We'll be right back.